I was homeless at the time this happened, which is not something I'm proud of, but it's something that did happen nonetheless. When I was 20 years old, I was in a pretty major car accident that resulted in the complete amputation of my left leg. This made it super hard to find work after the year-long recovery. My parents already wanted nothing to do with me by then. You see, I had dated a guy in high school that they didn't approve of, so they both basically shunned me until I moved out when I was 18, and I haven't spoken to either of them since. There was a moment during my recovery when I considered reaching out to them for support, but I figured they would just refuse to talk to me like they'd always done in the past. I'd looked for a job in the 4 years that had passed since that accident, but of course, nobody wants to hire a woman with only one leg and no home. They can't technically admit that's the reason, but everyone knows that it is. So I decided to live out of my car, and whatever money I got from donations around town, I used to pay for a gym membership. From the very beginning of my fall into homelessness, I knew I needed to find a place that I could shower and use the bathroom throughout the day whenever I wanted or needed to. Hygiene was very important, and I was not going to let homelessness take that away from me. I figured the gym was the perfect place for this. It was open 24 hours a day, and nobody would ever question why I was going in and out multiple times to use the restroom. The plan actually worked out perfectly for a couple of years. Nobody ever asked any questions, and if I ever got bored, I would go in and actually work out for a few hours. It was a little bit hard with the whole one leg thing, but I managed to make it work. I did exercises I could do with my arms, and tried to ignore the stares I got because of it. After about a couple of years or so, I decided to change gyms though. The one I'd been going to was becoming more and more expensive. The new gym I signed up for was in a more harsh part of town. I didn't mind that it wasn't as nice though, since it only existed for me to serve its purpose. I was able to take showers and use restrooms the same as the other gym. The only thing I didn't like about this one was the location. Because I usually had to use the bathroom late at night as well, I had to park nearby. I always tried to switch up my parking space, but this time I figured parking behind the building wouldn't be such a big deal for only one night. I parked out back and settled in for the night. Usually I'd put a sun shield on my windshield and cover my windows with towels and blankets so no one could see inside. It felt much more safe and secure that way. Around 3 a.m. though, I started hearing a knocking at my car windows. I'll admit I was quite scared and I didn't know what to do. I laid in my backseat with my eyes squeezed shut as tightly as possible, not knowing if I should say anything or not. I didn't know if it was the police asking me to leave or if it was someone who was there to hurt me, but I really didn't want to find out either way. The knocking on the windows continued for what felt like forever. Eventually it stopped, and I just sat there waiting for it to come back. It didn't. Instead of knocking, I started to hear a soft whistling circling around me. It started quietly, but as time went by, it became louder and more high-pitched. Whoever was trying to get my attention had succeeded. At that point, I was totally freaking out. I wanted to call the police, but I couldn't. I was parked there illegally, and I knew it would bring unnecessary attention towards me in the long run. After a while of the circling whistling, it went into silence, and I thought it would finally be over. That's when I began to hear the person outside talking. At first, his voice was so soft I could barely hear him. I didn't even know what he was saying. Then it sounded like he was pressing his mouth up right against the door into the small crack where the door shuts, almost like he wanted to be sure that I could hear him. He started calling out to me. He did this a few times before finally saying, "I know you're in there. Just open the door. Come out and play, please." I felt tears beginning to roll down my face. I figured it was only a matter of time before he broke into my car whether I wanted him to or not, and did whatever he wanted to do with me. This was the one thing I had always been scared of when it became apparent I couldn't find a place to live. The man kept taunting me through the window. He got more and more mad with each word, too. "I know you live in there. I see you go back to your car every time you leave the gym. Just open the door. I promise I'll help you. Open it up before I get really angry." I couldn't speak even if I wanted to. The words just wouldn't come out. I started debating on whether or not I should actually speak back to him and ask him what he wanted, or tell him to leave me alone. I knew this was a bad situation to be in, but I was still frozen in the spot. I started trying to make plans in my head of what I could do to get myself out of this horrible thing that was happening to me. Finally, I mustered the courage to climb into my front seat. As soon as I moved, I heard the man call out once more. "I hear you moving around in there. Are you finally gonna let me in?" I heard him beginning to tug the handles, looking for a way inside. They were all locked, thankfully. I felt the car now begin to move from side to side as he leaned against it while pushing as hard as he could, desperately trying to get into my car. I fumbled around in my bag for my keys, and when I finally found them, I started my car, put it into gear, and ripped the sunshield off in one quick motion. I began to speed away, and I heard a loud thud. I felt the car move slightly as I drove off, but there was no way I was stopping to see what it was. I drove for hours. I needed to get away from that man and that city. Granted, I might have become paranoid, but I didn't want to risk running into him again, especially since I had no idea what he looked like, but he knew exactly who I was. When I finally stopped, I noticed a large dent in the rear of my car. I figured that was the outcome of the thud I'd heard while driving away. I didn't care though, as long as I was okay and my car still drove. I canceled that gym membership over the phone and joined another in the city I had driven to a few hours away. I used that gym for a couple of years before meeting my now husband there, who I've been happily married to for 8 years. We have 2 beautiful children, and I'm glad I never have to think about that man or those awful sleepless nights in my car all alone ever again. I'm gonna try to be as honest as possible when I say I absolutely hate going to the gym. I hate the musty smell when you walk in, all the sweaty people leaving sweat stains on the equipment and refusing to wipe them down, and the crowds that bring so much noise. It's not a peaceful environment like all gym rats like to say it is. It's very stressful to me and gives me horrible anxiety when I think about going. I love food though, and when I don't work out, I gain weight very fast. It doesn't look or feel very good. So yes, I only go to the gym so I can eat whatever I want to without gaining weight in the end. Some people may find that a strange reason to work out, but I in turn could say an addiction to pre-workout is pretty strange too, yet people definitely have that. Now, a little bit about me. I'm a 24-year-old guy named Tony, and I live about 20 minutes out of town on a farm. I don't go to the gym every day because of this. I try to go about 4 times a week or so, but obviously gas is getting quite expensive. This specific day started out like any other. I woke myself up, made myself a protein shake, grabbed my gym bag, and started driving towards town. It was a nice drive. Lots of mountain views and lakes along the way. Usually, I'd try to soak in the scenery, which made the drive go by way faster. I pulled up to the gym and it was all business as usual. Went in, started my workout with weights, then moved on to the leg press. Now, I fucking despise the leg press. I mean, I've seen those videos where people bend their knees backwards, so I'm always kind of nervous using that machine. That's really the only concern I had about it though. It went smoothly, so I got up to wipe the bench. When I did, I noticed a sharp pain in my calf. It almost felt like a pinch or something. When I looked down, I noticed I had a very small cut on my calf. I noticed the leg press had a small piece of metal attached that was barely poking out enough to scratch my leg. I figured it was just a small cut that I could wash off when I took a shower at home. I finished my workout for the day and headed back out. On the drive back home though, I started to feel more pain in my leg where the cut was. It was almost kind of itchy, like a hot to the touch kind of thing. I didn't want to scratch it in case that made it worse, so I put it in the back of my mind and continued on my way home. I jumped right into the shower the second I got inside and began furiously scrubbing my leg and washing it out, mostly to get the itch to go away. Cleaning the actual cut wasn't my main priority at this point. All I could think about was how badly this was itching. I scrubbed it with soap and an exfoliator, but nothing would help that itch go away. I finished up in the shower, got dressed, and decided it would be a good time to really inspect this cut closer. I turned the flashlight on my phone and turned my leg as best I could to look at the small cut. It looked a bit inflamed. At the time, I figured it was because I'd spent the past 30 minutes rubbing at it with a pretty abrasive sponge. Must have irritated it, I thought. I ended up just putting a band-aid on it and forgetting about it for the rest of the night. It itched here and there, but I ended up getting used to it, and before I knew it, I was fast asleep. The next morning, though, I woke up with my whole leg feeling hot, almost bloated, if that makes any sense. I took the band-aid off. The cut certainly didn't look good. It was swollen and puffy and had bright red skin around the edges. It looked like it was oozing some sort of pus, too. I called my mom, who told me it was probably infected. She said to go to the store and get some antibiotic ointment for it, so that's what I did. I wrapped it up and headed to the store to get some ointment and possibly more bandages now that my small band-aids weren't able to keep it contained anymore. I picked up whatever it looked like would help and rushed home. The itchiness had soon come back, and I just couldn't take it anymore. By that night, my leg had become so inflamed and painful that I started having a hard time walking on it. The ointment didn't seem to be working, and the cut got worse and worse. It was leaking this yellow goo that just didn't seem to stop, and I had the worst time falling asleep. Throughout the night, I'd be woken up by the horrible pain in my calf, like someone was taking a hot iron directly to my leg. The next morning, my symptoms were the same, only I couldn't put any pressure on my leg without unbearable pain. I kept reapplying the ointment, and every second praying it would get better. Throughout the day, I was getting random feelings of nausea and even slight headaches. I hate going to the doctor, so I was trying to put that off as long as possible. I told myself that if I didn't get any better by the next morning, I would take myself to the hospital. Well, I bet you can guess I did not get better. You'd be right if you thought it got worse, much worse. What had once been a small, tiny cut and now festered into a large lesion that was oozing pus and blood. I couldn't even stand on my leg. I'd woken up in a pool of sweat with pretty intense dizziness. I knew something was very, very wrong. At that point, I knew I couldn't ignore this obviously very serious infection anymore, but I also couldn't drive myself to the hospital without using my leg. I called my mom and told her what was going on. You should have heard the worry in her voice. I could tell she was very scared. She lives in town, so it took her about 20 minutes to get to me. It also wasn't easy for her to help me into the car. She's a small woman, and now I wasn't able to use either of my legs, so I relied heavily on leaning on her. Must have been pretty hard. On the way to the hospital, I started feeling really lightheaded, almost like I was going to pass out. My mom kept desperately telling me to stay awake. I remember her rolling the window down so the cold air would rush against me. It did make me feel a little less hot, so I guess in her own way she was helping me. She pulled into the emergency section, and before I knew it, people were rushing over to me in a stretcher. I was lifted from the seat in the car onto the gurney and immediately wheeled away. I could hear my mom in the distance, asking them if I was going to be okay. I couldn't hear what they were saying, since the doctors were asking me a bunch of questions. I only managed to answer one. They asked me how I'd gotten the cut, and all I could say was Jim before I completely blacked out. By the time I woke up, it had been a few days since my admittance into the hospital. It turns out that small cut I got at the gym had developed into a full-blown MRSA infection in my leg. Because I left it untreated for a few days, it caused me to go into acute kidney failure. I guess this type of infection spreads very easily in the gym or athletic settings. They said my case was pretty bad to have progressed so quickly. I was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, while on IV antibiotics for my leg and treatment for my kidneys. It's been a year since, and I've mostly recovered. I have nearly normal kidney function now, which I'm extremely grateful for. I still go to the gym, but I'm super careful with cleaning the equipment and to check if there's any more surprise metal sticking out anywhere. If I ever get any more cuts or scratches, the first thing I do is wash it off and cover it up. To anyone who spends a lot of their time in the gym and doesn't think twice when they get a tiny cut, please use my story as a lesson so you don't make the same mistake that I did. This story actually happened to my sister. Back in 2009, my then 21-year-old sister was living all alone after getting into a big fight with our parents. She worked as a waitress while going to school, so obviously money was quite scarce. Because of this, she was living in a very bad part of town, in an apartment complex that from far away looked okay, but things got very weird once you got closer. It was one of those 2-floor South Florida buildings, but all but maybe 5 units were currently occupied. Only 5 out of 18. The rest were in such bad shape that they couldn't even be rented out. We're talking about giant holes in the roof, broken pipes, etc. One night, my sister was just getting home around 11 p.m. after her shift had finished. And that was when she noticed an old van parked in one of the spots right next to the stairs she had to take to go up to her apartment. I guess natural instincts kicked in because she decided not to use those stairs and to use the other set at the other end of the building. She had to walk across the entire parking lot to reach these stairs though. As she was doing this and going up the stairs, she looked over at the van and realized there were 2 people waiting inside, sitting in the dark and staring at her. She decided to hurry up and sort of sprinted to her apartment. As soon as she started moving faster though, the 2 men hopped out of the van and began running up the stairs next to their van to try and catch up to her. Her apartment was so close to those stairs that by the time she was near her door, they were already halfway up. She was not going to make it in time. She turned around and started running towards the other set of stairs she had just come from. By the time she was going back down, the men were still chasing after her, running on the 2nd floor towards her direction. She couldn't run across the parking lot back onto the street because they would have caught her easily. She had to make a choice. She ran to the back of the building, hoping to jump the fence or something. Well, too bad. The fence was way too high. Obviously, she was not going to make it. She spotted, all the way in the corner though, this big dumpster that had a lock on it. She ran towards it, hoping to get on it and jump the fence, then get onto the street. When she jumped on top to climb though, the entire plastic lid collapsed with her weight and she fell inside the dumpster. She could hear from inside the guys turning into this area. "Keep an eye out, she must be inside one of these apartments." I remember they were abandoned and had no windows at the time. They started calling out to her, telling her to get out and to not be scared. She was inside the dumpster, holding the broken cover up with her hands from underneath to make it look as if it was still properly closed. They got near, and she could hear their steps. Since the dumpster was locked, I guess they didn't even try to pull up the lid. It was that tiny innocent lock, holding this broken up thing together, that saved my sister's life that night. Had they pushed the whole thing up, it would have fallen apart immediately, and my sister would have been exposed and probably murdered. From inside that dumpster, she could hear them searching each individual apartment. The whole thing must have taken 40 minutes before they eventually gave up and left without finding her. My sister didn't sleep, didn't move, and didn't leave that dumpster until the following morning. She got out when she heard cars and saw daylight once again. The van was no longer there, and she moved back home that very same day. I live in a small town where everyone knows everyone and everything. My sister, 16 and female, and I, 17 and female, adore film photography, so we were hopping from park to park just this past April to get shots of the spring foliage. My school is located in the middle of the woods, just off of a residential area. Down an adjacent road is this beautiful scenic mountainous park of about 250 acres with various recreational sections. Playgrounds, hiking trails, you name it. I visited the park to read frequently in isolation, but it was always fairly empty. That day would be no exception, as it was overcast and rainy. The previous, much more popular parks we visited were even devoid of people that day too. On the way to the park, I hit a light that essentially functioned as a stop sign. I lingered just a bit because people tended to cut me off. Another car to my left, something like a 2000s Toyota Camry, had stopped just a hair after mine. My blinker was on to make a right, and they had no blinker on at all, so it seemed we were going in the same direction. As we climbed the hill towards the park, I glanced in my rearview mirror to find the oddity of the car hanging back at a snail's pace. A line of cars were jammed up behind it. I remember wondering why this guy was going 25 miles per hour when the limit was 45. As the hill crested, I made a left into the park we wanted to visit, and lo and behold, it was absolutely empty. Perfect for taking photos. We passed approximately 5 parking lots with their respective playgrounds and soccer fields and trails, winding through the hilly terrain before we came upon the lot I typically parked and read in. This, in my opinion, was the prettiest part of the land here, with tall trees encapsulating the back and sides, and a picturesque view of the mountains and foliage in the front. Today it was painfully dreary looking, and although we expected to see more buds and blossoms, the majority of the trees still remained bare. I suggested turning around to my sister until she insisted we explore to the end of the park. I thought it couldn't possibly hurt much, so we continued forward, descended the hill, and came upon a dead end. The road was not very long, with a parking lot to the right, and one all the way to the end on the left as well. It was as we were going down that road that I happened to absent-mindedly glance in my rearview mirror. I saw that very same car from earlier. It had been following us, distantly, as to remain out of sight. But as we approached this surprise dead end, it suddenly sprang back into view. Thoughts began to flood my mind. Who would go this far to an isolated park on a rainy day other than us? What are the chances they would be going to the very same dead end we were when there were 8 or 9 empty lots before there and there was nothing to do down here? Who was in that car? I was hoping it was a woman and her kids who had gotten lost or something. The entrance to the lots was the width of one car, framed by deep ditches on both sides. I kept thinking to myself, if I pull into that lot and park, that car will block me in at the entrance. If I try to escape, my car will plummet into those ditches. At this point, it was all coming out as incoherent, frantic babbling to my sister though. I swung into a random lot, and as the car continued towards us, I quite literally floored it in a whiplash-inducing crescent and booked it out the way we had come. Now I was creeping up the incline as the car was slowly descending. As we reached a perpendicular, I stole a look at the individual inside, a 45 to 50-year-old man I'd never seen before. I frantically climbed the hill, and we were now, luckily, a good distance away. The hill's elevation offered us a clear view of the car, and I instructed my sister to keep a vigilous watch as I continued driving. She reported him pulling into the center of the last lot as if to park, remaining still for a moment, and then swiftly turning around. I was shaking and checked my rearview mirror obsessively as we exited, descending the road we usually traversed. It was when I was nearing the initial stoplight the car had tailed me from that I glanced back again. In the usual fashion, the car had somehow caught up once more and was making a slow, snail-like approach from the distance. At this point, my sister received a well-timed call from my father. We informed him of the situation quickly. He did question us, but we were absolutely certain and insistent. He remained skeptical. I turned on my blinker to make a left. Even as far away as it was, the car behind us did the same. Adrenaline and panic surged, and I began racing down the road with the intent to sandwich multiple cars in between us and expand the distance. Somehow, that car still managed to follow the exact same distance behind though. I made multiple loops around town to assure we'd be safe, and this continued on for another hour until it finally worked and I lost him. I've since combed through sex offender registries of my town and neighboring ones and attempted to identify this car as well, but no luck. I can find no trace of the man. I mentioned previously that my town is very small, so I should have been able to find some trace of him. I'm also always cautious on the road, especially when approaching that light at the same time of day. I haven't returned to that park since, but I'm plagued with questions. What was the man's plan for us? My car had a very visible parking pass of the school my sister and I attended. I fear he intended to target us specifically because we were students and may target other students someday as well. After all, the school is not very far away from that area. Every time I see a similar car, my heart drops to my stomach.